At a lavish Thanksgiving dinner at my son's house, I stood frozen as my daughter-in-law tipped food onto me and grinned. Sorry you're getting old. Maybe you don't even realize what you're doing anymore. The whole table stared at me as though I were. Then my own son stepped forward, tossed a few bills at my face, and said coldly, "Take a cab home, Dad. Welcome to Wise Revenge. Glad you found your way here. If this is your first time, tap subscribe so the next story finds you without you having to go looking." Before we get into it, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening right now. Drop your city and the time there in the comments, because there's something about knowing a story like this one is reaching people across so many different places and hours that feels right. One more thing, this story contains fictional elements added to serve the telling of it. Any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental, but the truth at the heart of it, that part, is very real. Names and settings are coincidental, but what this story plants inside you is real. 68 years on this earth teaches you certain things. Chief among them, a man figures out how to read the gaps between words well before the words themselves tell him anything. The Monday my son phoned, those gaps were doing all the talking. I simply decided not to hear them. That's my failure to own. Russell Greer, that's who I am. 31 years I poured into building Greer Logistics from scratch. One leased truck, a phone that sat quiet most of the day. Eventually growing into a regional outfit with 38 employees and contracts across 3 states. I stepped away at 63 not because the body demanded it, but because Loretta did. "Russell," she told me, "your whole life you've been raising up something for somebody else. It's time you built something for the two of us." 3 months after that conversation, she was gone. A stroke, sudden and merciful the way she'd always hoped it would happen. No lingering, no one burdened on her account. 6 years have passed. I've spent them alone in the same house we called home for 30 years, on Hawthorne Ridge Road, east side of Indianapolis. Nothing grand about the place. 3 bedrooms, a back porch where the late afternoon light pools just right, and a kitchen permanently scented with the coffee I brew far too strong every single morning. The neighbors have labeled me an oddball. I cut my own grass. I get around in a 2007 Toyota Camry with a crack in the dashboard. What they can't see is that every one of those choices is intentional. That Monday morning, I was at the kitchen table, second cup in hand, bent over the scarf. Loretta had begun knitting it the winter before her stroke. Dark green wool and uncomplicated stitch intended for Nathan. She never got to the end. 6 months after we buried her, I found it in her craft basket, the needles still seated in the last completed row, as though she'd only stepped away for a moment and somehow never returned. I learned the craft myself, working through a YouTube video made by a retired librarian in Vermont, 4 months before the tension stopped fighting me. By that Monday, I was nearly at the finish, determined to have it wrapped up ahead of Thanksgiving. The phone went off at 8:47 in the morning. I noted the clock the instant I saw Nathan's name light up the screen. My son was not a frequent caller. His calls, when they came, generally meant he wanted something. "Dad." The warmth in his voice was the warmth of an October afternoon, agreeable on the surface, carrying a cold current beneath it for anyone patient enough to notice. "Nathan." I set my mug down. "Is something wrong?" "No, everything's actually great. Really great." Saying it twice told me he was steadying his nerves. "Listen, Vivica and I have been talking. We want you here for Thanksgiving. The full dinner, the whole evening." Something moved in my chest. A tightening half hope and half wariness. The sensation scar tissue makes when barometric pressure drops. "Thanksgiving," I said back to him. "Thursday evening. We're having guests, some colleagues, a couple of friends, but you belong there, Dad. Your family. We miss you. We miss you." I rolled that phrase around slowly, the way you work a river stone between your fingers, hunting for where it's worn smooth. 4 years had gone by since I'd sat at Nathan and Vivica's Thanksgiving table. That last time, Vivica had occupied herself across the meal, explaining to every guest why she'd transformed the spare room, the one historically kept for my visits, into a home office. I'd made a 2-hour drive and checked into a hotel. "Who's coming?" I asked. "Mostly business. Some investors I've had my eye on." A subtle shift in his register. "It'll be a strong room, accomplished people. You'll fit right in. Accomplished people." Vivica's phrasing, not Nathan's. I could sense her presence somewhere just off the call, the way you're aware of street noise beyond a shut window there, but filtered. "I'd like that very much," I said. Because I needed it to be the truth. Because Nathan was my son, and needing something to be true is sometimes the closest a hard-headed old man gets to prayer. Perfect. His relief came too fast, too clean, the exhale of someone who'd been quietly bracing for a refusal. "Thursday 6/0. I can send you the address. Nathan, I know where you live." "Right, yeah." A beat of silence. "It'll be good, Dad. Really good to see you." I stayed at the table a while after the call ended. The scarf rested across my knees, soft, almost complete. I took up the needles again and worked through the remaining rows, one after the next, in the quiet that fills a house built for two when only one remains. My mind drifted to what Loretta might have said about this. She'd always had a clearer read on Nathan than I managed, or perhaps the distinction is that she understood him and chose him anyway, the more difficult of the two things. "He's trying Russell," she'd remind me in the moments when his remoteness or his excuses wore me thin, when I could see the habits Vivica had shaped in him, treating every kindness as a ledger entry. "He's just lost right now. Keep that door open." The door had stayed open. I'd been the one holding it for a long time. That evening, I completed the final row, bound off the edge the way the Vermont librarian had walked me through, and wove in the ends with a blunt needle Loretta had picked up at a craft store in 2016. I folded it the way she would have, precisely with care, and laid it in a small box on a bed of tissue paper. It wasn't meant to be a lavish thing. 30 years of a life pressed into 12 inches of dark green wool. I was carrying it to my son because nothing else I could think to bring felt honest. Some gifts aren't really about giving. They're about saying I was here thinking of you in all the time you weren't thinking of me. The box went on the counter. I told myself to stop overthinking a dinner invitation. Nathan was my son. A holiday meal together was not a mystery to be solved. Distance closes. Families circle back. It's not unheard of. But in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I went looking for the last time Nathan had called, with no agenda, no ask, no update, just the simple desire to hear how I was. I traced it back and back until I reached the year Loretta died, and then I let it go. 3 days later, I made the drive on my own. Nobody rang to offer a ride. I hadn't entertained the thought they would. I pulled out from the east side of Indianapolis at 4:30, padding the time because my knees have registered a formal complaint about highway driving since I hit 65, and because I intended to walk in composed. Loretta used to say that a person arriving wound tight has already lost half the room. Tension announces itself before you open your mouth, and once it's in the room, you can't call it back. Meridian Hills was the kind of address where every hedgerow had been shaped by someone paid to shape it, and the mailboxes were worth more than my first vehicle. I'd visited twice. The first occasion was a dinner party where Vivica presented me to her circle as Nathan's father, the retired businessman, with a particular stress on retired that gave it the flavor of a condition requiring management. The second visit, I delivered a check, substantial, The figure isn't mine to name that spared Nathan's expansion from folding before it ever properly stood. Vivica had accepted the envelope at the front door with a smile that stopped at her cheekbones and told me they were heading out. I left the Camry at the far end of the block, tucked in behind a lineup of vehicles whose combined value likely exceeded everything I'd built in my first 10 years of operation. A black Escalade, a silver BMW, something low and German that I couldn't put a name to, but recognized as the kind of machine purchased to draw a particular kind of eye. I sat still behind the wheel a moment, the box holding Loretta's scarf riding the passenger seat. "You all right, Retta?" I said it quietly, the way I still speak to her, when I'm certain no one can hear. "Let's go see what this is." I did up my jacket, a charcoal blazer I'd bought years ago, well looked after, because Loretta always maintained it. Suited me, lifted the box, and crossed toward the entrance. The house threw light in every direction. Through the high windows at the front, I could make out elegantly dressed figures moving through the rooms, the flash of crystal, the careful choreography of waitstaff in white shirts navigating the crowd. When someone opened the door, a thread of classical music wound out into the evening, understated, ornamental, selected, to advertise a certain refinement rather than to actually be enjoyed. Vivica was waiting at the door. She had on a champagne-colored dress bearing some designer's name I wouldn't have known to recognize. Her dark hair was arranged with the kind of exactness that comes from standing in front of a mirror longer than most people sit down for breakfast. Her smile materialized the instant she spotted me, swift, rehearsed, and carrying roughly the same warmth as the November chill at my back. "Russell." She angled in for the variety of hug that keeps two bodies at a careful distance. "You made it." I said I would. Her eyes were already working quick and methodical, the way a hawk tracks movement below. Down to my blazer, across to the Camry, still sitting at the far end of the block, back to my face. Whatever her assessment added up to, she kept it locked away. She drew back, swept one hand toward the interior, a gesture that somehow managed to be both an invitation and a dismissal, and let me through. The house hit me in waves. 40, maybe 50 guests in formal dress, a dozen conversations stacked on top of one another, like overlapping broadcasts. Glasses chimed at steady intervals. Servers threaded through the crowd with the fluid efficiency of people who do this for a living, trays bearing champagne flutes and small architecture-forward bites of food that looked as though they'd been assembled by someone with a degree in aesthetics. I stood just inside the door, holding my box. Vivica turned to a young woman stationed at her elbow, an assistant clearly armed with a tablet and the focused expression of someone awaiting orders. "Make sure Mr. Greer Sr. is seated away from the main table." Vivica's voice dropped just enough to suggest privacy, while landing just loud enough to reach me without effort. "Near the back, east window." The assistant logged this without so much as a glance in my direction. I said nothing. Something cinched tight behind my breastbone, that old, familiar pressure I've spent years learning to breathe past. The particular sensation of being reclassified in a room you believed you'd been invited to join into a problem that requires managing. Nathan materialized 3 minutes later. He had on a suit I'd never seen, charcoal gray, evidently new, evidently expensive, and he moved through the crowd with the fluid ease of a man who had rehearsed this version of himself until it felt like skin. He put out his hand, not an embrace, a handshake firm, compact, the kind you offer to a professional acquaintance you hold in moderate regard. "Dad, glad you came." His gaze was already sweeping past my shoulder, working the room with the quick attentiveness of someone managing a production. "You look good." You look tired," I said because it was true. Beneath the polish, his eyes held the specific exhaustion of someone who has been performing for too long. Something moved across his face, not irritation, but a flash of recognition. He knew I wasn't wrong. "It's been a busy stretch," he said. "Listen, make yourself comfortable. There are people I need to—" He was already pivoting. "We'll catch up later, Nathan." He stopped. I held up the box. "I brought something for you." He looked at it the way you look at an object that has no clear place in the current moment. "Oh." He took it from me, his tone recalibrating toward something more guarded. "Thanks, Dad. I'll open it in a bit." He tucked it under his arm and turned back toward the center of the room, toward the cluster of men near the fireplace, laughing at a volume calibrated to be heard. I watched him go. Watched his posture shift the moment he rejoined that group, shoulders squared, grin wider, voice a register louder. I watched him step completely into the person those men had come expecting. I stood near the entrance of my son's home with empty hands, surrounded by strangers, and I tried to work out whether Nathan had always possessed that gift, the ability to shed oneself and wear another so completely, or whether that was something Vivica had trained into him, the way you rehearse a child before the company arrives. A server passed within reach, and I stopped him. "Excuse me, could I get a glass of water?" He looked at me directly the way people who work in rooms like this learn very efficiently not to do, and said, "Of course, sir. Right away." More genuine courtesy in 4 words than I'd encountered from anyone else in that house in the past 10 minutes. I thanked him and meant every syllable of it. I found the chair by the east window where Vivica had arranged for me to be placed. I sat. I rested my hands in my lap and looked out at the November darkness pressing flat against the glass. I thought about Loretta's scarf riding under Nathan's arm, traveling away from me into a crowd that had no idea it existed. I reminded myself that I had occupied harder rooms than this one, that patience and weakness are not the same condition, that the night was still early. That last part, at least, turned out to be true. There is a specific kind of invisibility that accompanies a certain age, and I have come to terms with most of it. Servers look through you. Younger people complete your sentences, having already decided you've mislaid the thought. You become part of the room's scenery, present and functional, and largely unregistered. That evening in my son's house, I was as thoroughly unseen as I had ever been anywhere. And men who go unseen, as I have come to understand, are privy to things never intended for them. I had been at that east window for nearly 20 minutes when my back raised its usual objection, the L4 vertebra that's filed a standing grievance since a warehouse accident in 1993. I got up slowly, working out the stiffness, and moved along the edge of the room, looking for the restroom. I followed the perimeter, keeping to the wall out of the current of moving guests. That's what brought me near the staircase tucked into the alcove, where the coat room door hung half open just around the bend from where Nathan was holding court with a knot of men in dark suits. I wasn't concealing myself. I was simply there and no one looked my way. "Greer's father is here tonight." The voice belonged to one of Nathan's group, flat and measured, shaped by years in boardrooms, pitched to carry precisely as far as intended. "Said the old man is personally backing the new expansion. Something about a family investment." "Yeah," another voice. "That's what Nathan's been telling people." My stomach fell several inches. "Really?" The first man sounded skeptical, the way experienced investors sound when an arithmetic problem doesn't resolve cleanly. I had the impression Greer Sr. had been out of the picture for years, so it's apparently not. He's been dropping the name all night. "My father built Greer Logistics from the ground up. My father knows this market. You know how that goes." I pressed my shoulders flat against the wall. My heart was striking my ribs harder than it had in years. Nathan had been invoking my name, my history, using my reputation as collateral for money he'd never approached me to provide. I had built that company across 31 years with my hands and Loretta's steadiness, and more sleepless nights than I stopped tracking long ago. My name carried something in Indianapolis logistics circles, not because of wealth or influence, but because in 3 decades I had never broken a commitment or abandoned a contract. And my son was burning through that name tonight, like coins he'd found in someone else's coat. I stepped further back into the alcove, one hand braced against the wall, to steady myself, my jaw so tight it ached. Then Vivica's voice reached me. She was perhaps 15 feet off her back toward me, speaking into her phone in the low-clipped register of someone transacting business that requires no audience. "He's here." A pause. "No, not yet. He's being cooperative so far, which is perfect." Another pause. "I need the notary on standby after 9:00. We'll have the documents ready. He'll sign tonight." Shorter pause this time. "Because he won't want a scene. You know how these old men are. Too proud to make a fuss." My hand pressed harder into the plaster, cold and unyielding beneath my palm. "A notary, documents, he'll sign tonight." I turned the words over, the way I used to work through a contract with terms designed to obscure hunting for the exit clause. The buried catch, the point where the language curls back against you. I had done enough business to know that when someone arranges a notary without your knowledge, they are not intending to request your signature. They are intending to collect it. "What documents?" I held the question like a stone there in that alcove. But I already had a strong suspicion. The house on Hawthorne Ridge Road, the only meaningful asset in my name that Nathan had ever brought up wanting. He'd raised it twice in the past year. Once offhandedly, once with more directness, both times wrapped in language about growth and investment and helping the business move forward. Both times I'd guided the conversation somewhere else. I had never refused him plainly. I saw that now, standing in that alcove with my palm against cold plaster and my pulse loud in my ears. I looked down at my hands. 68 years old. These hands had wrestled freight at 3 in the morning when payroll couldn't yet stretch to hired help. These hands had held Loretta's face on our wedding day. These hands had put their name to every honest document I'd ever executed, and had never once signed anything without reading it twice and understanding it completely. I eased out of the alcove unhurried and quiet, and made my way back to the east window. My legs felt more solid than I would have predicted. When bad news has found you enough times across a life, the body learns to absorb the first strike before the second one arrives. I lifted my water glass from the side table where I'd left it, took a long, slow sip, and let my gaze go out into the November dark. The yard lights threw long shadows across the lawn, costly shadows over carefully tended grass, in a house I was beginning to understand had been constructed on borrowed assumptions. A young server materialized at my elbow tray in hand-brows raised in polite inquiry. "Can I get you anything, sir? We have the smoked salmon crostini or—" "No, thank you." My voice held steadier than I felt. "Actually, yes. Another glass of water, if you would." He gave me a real smile, not the decorative variety, and went to get it. I watched Nathan across the room. Laughing now, one hand resting on the shoulder of a suited man inhabiting the role of self-made success with the ease of someone who had practiced the part for years. He had not glanced my way once since tucking Loretta's scarf under his arm and walking off. My son was trading on my name to pull in money from strangers. His wife was arranging a notary to claim my house. And somewhere inside this polished, expensive room, a clock was quietly advancing toward 9:00. I set my water glass down. My fingers held steady. In my chest, something sat that was neither quite anger nor quite grief, something older and quieter than both. The feeling of a man who has given everything he had and is only now beginning to total up what it cost. I didn't yet know what they needed me to sign, but one thing I knew without any room for doubt, whatever it was, they had been working toward this for a long time. Tonight was not a dinner invitation. Tonight was a closing argument. And I had walked straight into it carrying a box of green wool and 30 years of willful faith in my son. Dinner was called at 7:00, a server tapping a small chime near the dining room entrance, the sound delicate and almost apologetic, as though it understood it was interrupting matters larger than itself. I followed the crowd in. The table was long enough to seat 30 with ease, dressed in white linen, with centerpieces of white calla lilies, and candles in crystal holders scattering light across every surface. A beautiful table. Loretta would have admired it, then quietly observed that calla lilies are difficult and white linen forgives nothing. My place card sat at the far end, the last seat before the kitchen door where the servers came and went in their practiced rotation. The positioning was not an accident. Nothing tonight had been an accident. But I had made up my mind, before I took that seat, that I was going to give Nathan the gift properly, whatever else the evening amounted to. I was not walking out of that house without doing that much. I waited until the first course had been set down, a French onion soup that smelled genuinely good, then got to my feet, walked the full length of the table and placed the box in front of Nathan. Conversation within a few feet fell to half its volume. Nathan looked up from whatever he'd been saying to the man at his left, his gaze moving between my face and the box. "Dad." His tone stayed pleasant, the way you hold a door open without actually welcoming anyone through. "What's this?" "Open it," I said. He glanced at Vivica. She was watching with the focused attention of someone trained to recognize a threat before it fully forms. He lifted the lid. The scarf lay folded inside dark green against the tissue paper, finished and precise. Nathan lifted it in both hands, and for one moment, a single unguarded moment, something traveled across his face that looked like the boy he had once been. His jaw shifted. The edges of his eyes went soft. Then Vivica's voice crossed the table like a blade through paper. "What on earth is that?" She said it pleasantly. That was the cruelest part, the pleasantness deployed as camouflage, making the cruelty sound like simple curiosity. "It's a scarf," I said. "Loretta started it the winter before she passed. I finished it. I thought Nathan might want... Loretta's been gone 6 years, Russell." Her voice moved easily down the length of the table, drawing the attention of every nearby guest, the way a current collects what's floating near it. She lifted the scarf from Nathan's hands, using 2 fingers, index and thumb, the way you handle something whose cleanliness you aren't certain of, and held it briefly aloft for the nearest guests. Her expression sat somewhere between bemusement and condescension. "I'm sure the sentiment is lovely, but we can't exactly display yarn at a dinner table." Someone laughed. Short quickly reined in. "But I heard it the way you hear ice fracturing underfoot." "Vivica," Nathan started. "We have guests, sweetheart." Her smile didn't shift by a fraction. She reached sideways and dropped the scarf into the wicker wastebasket beside the serving cart. The sound it made, soft, barely a sound at all, landed somewhere behind my sternum like a closed hand. My throat seized so hard I had to swallow twice. My eyes burned at the corners, sudden and sharp, in a way I hadn't felt since the night the hospital called about Loretta. I pressed my back molars together, breathed steadily through my nose, and refused, absolutely refused, to let anyone at that table see my eyes go wet over a piece of wool. Because it wasn't wool. That was what none of them could understand. That scarf was Loretta beside the lamp in our bedroom, on winter evenings, reading glasses sitting low on her nose, the needles moving in that particular rhythm that meant she was at peace. It was the last thing her hands had made, the last thing I had finished on her behalf. And now it was sitting in a wastebasket next to a serving cart, in a room where not one soul felt the weight of it but me. I stood at the far end of the table. 28 people were discovering urgent interest in their soup. Nathan had lifted his wine glass and was studying its contents with close attention. The man beside him murmured something, and Nathan responded with a brief laugh, the social reflex of someone trying to drain the air out of a difficult moment. I walked back to my seat. I sat down. I laid both hands flat on the linen tablecloth and looked at the soup bowl in front of me, the steam rising in fine threads, and I told myself to breathe. One breath, then another. An old technique Loretta had given me for the moments when stillness was the only dignified response. Mr. Greer. The server who'd brought me water earlier appeared at my left elbow, voice low and direct. Can I get you anything? I looked up at him. He was perhaps 25, with the careful expression of someone navigating something hard, school most likely, or debt, or both. He was looking at me the way a person looks when they've watched something unkind happen and don't know quite where to put what they've seen. I'm fine, I told him. Thank you for asking. He nodded, refilled my water without being asked, and slipped away. I picked up my soup spoon. My hand was trembling, not dramatically, not visibly from a distance, but I felt it, a faint vibration in my fingers that I recognized as the physical form of grief that has nowhere to land. I set the spoon back down. Across the room, maybe 20 feet off the wastebasket, sat against the wall with Loretta's scarf inside it. Dark green wool in a wicker bin wedged between a serving cart and a wall. I thought about the evening I'd found it in her craft basket, needles still seated in the last row, the final stitches waiting. I thought about the 4 months it had taken to teach myself well enough to carry her work forward. I thought about 3 days ago in the kitchen, when I'd held the finished scarf up toward the light, checking the tension of the rows, making sure the place where her hands had stopped and mine had begun was invisible, that you couldn't see the seam between what she'd made and what I'd completed in her name. The soup had gone nearly cold by the time I lifted the spoon again. Around me, the table had found its rhythm again. Voices climbing glasses being refilled, the performance of a costly evening, resuming without interruption. And somewhere beneath the grief and the locked jaw and the heat behind my eyes that I would not allow to become tears in this room, a quieter thought was assembling itself. She had done that deliberately in front of witnesses. And she was not finished. The dinner carried on the way expensive dinners do after something ugly has been absorbed, with deliberate noise, with wine poured a fraction too eagerly, with the particular energy of a room that has collectively agreed to pretend it witnessed nothing. I finished my soup. It was cold, but I ate it regardless because wasting food has never sat right with me. Not after the years when wasting it wasn't an option. Silverware clicked against china, voices layered over one another, the production resuming as though the curtain had never wavered. Then Vivica stood up. She didn't need to raise her voice. Vivica Greer commanded a room through precision rather than volume, each word placed where it would carry the most weight. I want to make sure everyone is comfortable, she announced, her smile sweeping the table in a slow arc. We have a few special accommodations tonight for some of our guests. She turned toward the kitchen door and gave a single nod. A server emerged carrying a styrofoam takeout container, white, the sort you'd get from a roadside diner. He walked the entire length of the table and set it down in front of me. My name was written on the lid in black marker. Russell. Block letters. Neat and deliberate. The table went quiet in that specific way. That means everyone registered it, and no one will claim they did. I looked at the container. Then I looked at Vivica. She returned my gaze with an expression of magnificent concern. We know you prefer simple things, Russell. No need to stand on ceremony on our account. She turned to the guests nearest her with a small, confidential laugh. My father-in-law is very practical. Isn't that right, Russell? He always says the food doesn't need to be fancy. I had never said that. Not once in my life. My chest burned with something like swallowing a coal, hot and slow and settling somewhere deep. I kept my hands flat on the tablecloth. I kept my voice level. "That's very thoughtful, Vivica," I said. She tilted her head, the smile sharpening almost imperceptibly at its edges. "We try." Then louder, turning to address the full table with the ease of someone who had run this line before. "You know, everyone in this room has worked very hard to get here. We all make different choices about how we live, don't we? Some people choose comfort." Her eyes came back to me warm as a January window pane. "And some people choose thrift." The word landed precisely where she'd aimed it. Not as a compliment. The man 2 seats to my left, gray-haired, probably 70, with the hands of someone who'd worked outdoors before he'd worked indoors, shifted in his chair. His jaw tightened. He opened his mouth and then closed it again, the way a person does when they've done the math, and decided that speaking up will cost more than they're willing to spend right now. I knew that calculation. I had run it myself more times than I could number. "Thrift is a virtue," I said pleasantly. Loretta always thought so. Something crossed Vivica's expression, quick, barely there. The irritation of a woman whose script has drifted slightly off course. She recovered inside a second, the smile snapping back with the efficiency of a rubber band. "Of course it is," she said. "Now shall we bring out the main course?" The conversation restarted around me like an engine catching. I sat with the styrofoam container in front of me, my name in her handwriting on its lid, and I began working out the timeline of what that had required. She had written my name on that container before I arrived. She had arranged for it to be held in the kitchen, waiting. She had choreographed this moment, the audience, the reveal, the framing, with the same attention another woman might give a table centerpiece. This was not cruelty born of impulse. Anger is impulsive, reactive, human in its own way. This was something colder. Anger wearing a dinner dress and a composed smile. I did not open the container. I pushed it 2 inches to the left, clearing the space directly in front of me, and I picked up the fork from the place setting that had been laid at my spot. Because whatever Vivica had arranged, the staff had still dressed my place correctly. And that small, unreflective act of professionalism from someone doing their job honestly felt at that moment like the most decent thing in the room. Nathan, from his place at the head of the table, was midway through a story about a real estate transaction in Louisville that had apparently tripled in value. His hands moved with the confidence of a man who expected to be listened to. His eyes did not travel toward the far end of the table once. My son was 12 feet away, and as out of reach as if there were glass between us. Your water, sir." The young server from earlier appeared at my right, quiet and unhurried, refilling my glass without prompting. His eyes were trained straight ahead, professionally composed. But the care in how he moved around me told me he had seen everything and was offering the only assistance he was positioned to give. "Thank you," I said. And then, because I wanted him to know it wasn't reflexive, "I mean that." He gave me the smallest nod and continued on. I looked at my name on the styrofoam lid one more time. Russell. Her penmanship was precise and controlled the handwriting of a woman who understood the impression she made on paper. She had written this yesterday, perhaps the day before. She had sat somewhere in this house and written my name on a takeout container and felt some measure of satisfaction in the doing. And then I thought, the notary is on standby after 9:00. Whatever was in that container, it was not the main event. The main event was still coming. I have absorbed hard things quietly for most of my life. My father showed me how, not through instruction, but through the example of a man who worked double shifts at a paper mill for 22 years and never complained, at a volume his children could hear. There is a dignity that lives inside stillness, and some people spend their whole lives trying to locate it. I believed I had found mine. Vivica tested that belief at 7:50 in the evening. The main course had come. Roasted turkey, glazed carrots, a wild rice pilaf that smelled of thyme and butter. The table had eased into the comfortable cadence of people enjoying a good meal. One of the servers had placed a portion in front of me quietly and without comment, and I was eating because my body required fuel regardless of what my heart was carrying. Then Vivica's voice rose from the head of the table, pitched to Carrie. "Russell, you've barely touched a thing. Are you feeling all right?" Every head within earshot turned my way. I looked up. "I'm fine," I said. "The food is excellent." "You seem a little unsteady." Her voice was warm with manufactured concern, the way a stage set is warm, all surface, nothing behind it. "You're not having one of your dizzy spells, are you?" My stomach went cold. Dizzy spells. I had never had a dizzy spell. I was 68 years old, with a troublesome back and elevated cholesterol, but my balance had never once failed me. "I don't have dizzy spells, Vivica," I said, keeping my voice even. Of course, of course." She was already rising from her chair, lifting the nearest serving dish, a platter of glazed carrots in both hands. "Let me bring you a little more. You need to keep your strength up." She began moving around the table toward me, her assistant. The young woman who had been stationed near the kitchen entrance all evening drew out her phone. I caught it in my peripheral vision, the screen lighting up, the camera angling in my direction. I understood what was coming perhaps a half-second before it arrived. Vivica reached my chair and tipped the platter. Not by accident. There was no stumble, no snagged heel, no genuine loss of balance. She tipped it with the measured precision of a person who had already settled on exactly how much force the moment required. Glazed carrots and their syrupy sauce poured across my shoulder and down the front of my jacket, pooling in my lap. The heat and the stickiness hit all at once like a physical blow. My whole body went rigid. My hands seized the edge of the table, gripping the linen, and I felt my jaw clench so hard my back teeth ached. "Oh no," Vivica said, her voice pitched now for the camera, louder than any genuine distress would call for, theatrical in the precise way that reads cleanly on a small screen. "Oh, Russell, I'm so sorry. You moved just as I was. Are you all right? You seemed like you were leaning." Those words left my mouth clean and firm. I hadn't stumbled, hadn't wavered, and for that I was grateful. The poor dear. She turned to face the room with one hand pressed flat to her sternum, a performance of concern so well rehearsed, it curdled something in me. "He's been a little confused tonight, hasn't he? It's been a lot of stimulation." Confused. A little confused. Those 3 words cut deeper than this food had. I swept my gaze around the table. 28 faces each arranged in its own private version of discomfort, evasion, and something that drained the warmth right out of me. Several heads were moving in small, slow nods. Not cruelly, just accepting the narrative being offered to them, the way people accept the first explanation they're given for something they don't understand. The phone was still recording. The assistant angled it slightly downward, keeping me centered in the frame-stained jacket, white-knuckled hands on the cloth. Every possible response ran through my mind at once. Rising to my feet. Raising my voice. Lifting a finger toward that lens and saying out loud in plain words what was being done to me. And then I thought about what Vivica would do with footage of an old man coming apart at his own son's dinner table. How that kind of clip gets trimmed and titled and handed to a lawyer. How it reads to a judge who is being asked to decide whether a man can manage his own affairs. Because that was exactly what this was. The sauce had gone cold against my shoulder, and my pulse was loud in my ears, but my mind was perfectly clear. She wasn't doing this for the pleasure of humiliating me, though I had little doubt she found some pleasure in it. She was constructing something. a paper trail, a pattern. A confused old man, unsteady on his feet, quick to come undone. The precise profile that gives a court permission to hand your life to someone else. Conservatorship. To win one, you need documented evidence of incapacity. Vivica was generating that documentation live with 28 witnesses in the room and a camera rolling. I breathed in slowly, then again. I let go of the tablecloth and set both hands open and still against my thighs, feeling the damp fabric underneath. "I'm not confused," I said, and I made sure every person at that table could hear it. 31 years of sitting across tables from people who needed to know I was serious had given my voice a particular quality when I chose to use it. I am not dizzy. I did not move. That platter was tipped deliberately, and that phone I held the assistant's gaze until she blinked has been recording since before any of this started. Her arm dropped an inch. She looked toward Vivica. Vivica's expression didn't crack, but something shifted behind it, a rapid internal adjustment gone almost before it registered. Only someone who had spent 68 years reading the distance between a person's face and their thoughts would have caught it. "Russell," she said, her tone easing into something quiet and pointed. "You're upsetting yourself." "Why don't we—" "I am not upset." My back teeth were pressed so hard together my whole jaw ached. The sauce on my shoulder had cooled to a clammy weight. My heartbeat had climbed high enough that I could feel it pulsing at the base of my throat. What I am is alert. Those are two different things. The room seemed to stop breathing, and then a sound broke from the far side near the kitchen. Not the front door I'd half hoped for. Just the service entrance swinging wide as a server came through carrying another tray. That mundane, unheroic noise dispersed whatever tension had been gathering, and the silence that followed was of a specific kind, the silence of 28 people who had unanimously agreed to unsee what they had witnessed. Vivica composed herself. She took the empty platter from her assistant. The way an actor hands off a prop between scenes, ran both palms once down the front of her champagne dress and returned to her chair at the head of the table with the bearing of a woman who had merely paused to assist an elderly guest inconvenient. But what can one do? I remained where I was, sauce drying on my jacket, something cold and clarifying igniting in my chest. Not the reckless kind of anger that pushes words out before you've thought them through, but the other kind. The slow-burning kind that strips everything away and leaves only the things worth protecting. I breathed around it. I held still. I waited. Nathan got to his feet. Something leapt in my chest for the span of one heartbeat. One unguarded instinctive beat, the kind of reflex that belongs to an earlier decade when his every move was something I had shaped and taken pride in. He pushed the chair back, straightened his jacket, and came the full length of the table. 2 feet from me he stopped. His eyes dropped to the stain spreading across my lapel, and his jaw shifted slightly, a man working through something he had no words for. "Dad," he said, barely above a whisper, "you need to go." The sentence struck me somewhere just behind the eyes. The edges of my vision thinned and brightened the way they do when a blow arrives harder than you'd prepared for. "I need to go," I said back to him. "This isn't, you're making things difficult." He cut a glance toward Vivica, still seated at the head of the table watching us with the focused calm of someone running a production. "Vivica put a great deal of work into this evening. And you're Nathan." My voice dropped, but held. "Your wife just dumped food on me in front of a camera on purpose." His jaw pulled tight. "You moved." I did not move. My hands pressed into my legs. "You know I didn't. You were right there." Something moved across his face, quick and raw. The expression of a man who has full knowledge of the truth and has calculated what that truth will cost him. His hand went to the inner pocket of his jacket. For a disoriented moment, I assumed he was going for his phone. His hand came back out with his wallet instead. He opened it, counted out several bills, ones and fives, the kind of pocket change a man keeps when his real money comes in hundreds, and let them fall onto the linen in front of me. They spread across the cloth, a few drifting into the ring of moisture my glass had left. The shame of it hit me like something physical. My eyes stung, something thick lodged in my throat. 68 years old. Food on my jacket. Dollar bills crumpled on the tablecloth in front of me like I was a man on a curb he was trying to move along. "Get a cab home, Dad," Nathan said. His voice carried nothing in it. No heat, no contempt. Just the flat efficiency of a decision already made and being carried out. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." I stared at the bills. I stared at his face. My chest had tightened to the point where each heartbeat felt like a fist against a shut door. "Harder," I said quietly. Interesting choice of word. Nathan's hand went into his jacket a second time and came out with a document folded and stapled at the corner, printed on legal paper. He placed it beside the scattered bills and pressed it flat, and I read the heading before a word passed between us. "Property Transfer Agreement. Hawthorne Ridge Road, Indianapolis, Indiana. My house." The house where Nathan pulled himself up on the kitchen cabinets and took those first unsteady steps across the tile. The house where Loretta planted roses along the back fence, roses that came back faithfully every June long after she was gone. The house I had borrowed against once before 30 years ago to stake a young man's future, and spent 15 years paying down to nothing. "We need your signature tonight," Nathan said. "The bank requires it as collateral for the expansion of financing." It's straightforward. A property transfer agreement is simply a legal document that conveys ownership of real estate from one party to another. You'd be signing the house into a trust we control, which lets us use its equity to secure the loan. I raised my eyes to his. "You want me to sign over my house?" "It's just collateral, Dad. You want me to sign over the house where your mother died." Each word came out alone, set down with deliberate weight, one after the next. Nathan's face moved, not the managed expression he'd been wearing all evening, but something unscripted. Grief, sudden and genuine there and gone, sealed over before it could surface fully, the way a ripple closes on a pond. "Sign it tonight," he said, and the control in his voice had developed a fracture he couldn't quite repair. "Or don't. But if you don't—" He stopped. He swallowed. "If you don't, then I'm not sure what we are to each other from here." Dad. That final word, Dad, arrived like something hurled across the table. Not a name, a transaction. Sign and the title of father remains yours. Refuse and the terms of that word get rewritten. My hand moved toward the document. I'm not entirely certain what drove it. Something old, something worn into the bone. The reflex that tells you, give him what he needs. Give him what he needs. You can absorb it. You always have. My fingers lay across the top page. The paper was cool beneath my palm. I thought about Loretta's roses. I thought about the notary somewhere in this house waiting past 9:00. I thought about that recording, 10 minutes of footage Vivica had been accumulating, and what a signed property transfer would mean, stacked alongside a conservatorship filing. My fingers never found the pen. And then I heard something. Not the service door this time. Not crystal chiming or the low murmur of rehearsed pleasantries. What I heard was the front door of my son's house swinging open, and then footsteps, unhurried, certain, carrying none of the self-consciousness of someone who had come here to be seen. Enough years in business teaches you one reliable thing. When every person in a crowded room turns to look at the same spot at the same instant, whatever just walked through that door matters. The dining room shifted. not as one it moved in a wave, the way tall grass bends when the wind turns. The guests nearest the entrance first, then those deeper in conversations, unraveling mid-word wine glasses held suspended. I turned to, my hand still resting on Nathan's document. My jacket still ruined my chest, still tight. Vincent Drummond stood at the entrance to the dining room. I recognized him without hesitation, though nearly a decade had passed since we'd last been in the same room. He was 55 now, wider through the shoulders than the desperate 30-year-old I remembered, dark hair gone silver at the temples, his face carrying the particular gravity of a man who had built something real and understood what it had taken. He wore a charcoal suit, no tie collar, open at the throat, and he occupied that doorway the way certain men occupy a space, as though the frame had always been intended for him. At his side, a woman in her late 70s sat in a wheelchair, a wool blanket across her lap, her white hair pinned back with quiet precision. Cecile Drummond. I knew her face from a photograph, though we had never spoken. Vincent had shown it to me years before on a gray winter afternoon in my office when he'd come to tell me his mother had turned a corner. He'd wept that day quietly, carefully, the way men of a certain era weep, jaw set, face turned a few degrees away, fighting to keep it inside. I'd looked elsewhere and said nothing. That was the only tenderness the moment allowed. Nathan moved first. Naturally, Vincent Drummond was the most consequential man who would set foot in this house tonight, and Nathan had built the entire evening around the possibility of landing Drummond Global as an investor. He stepped away from me, the shift, seamless warmth dialed up instantly, his expression recomposed from confrontation to welcome in the time it takes to draw a breath. "Mr. Drummond," Nathan said, extending his hand, his voice rising into its most polished register. "We're honored. Please let me show you to—" In a moment. Vincent's voice was unhurried and conversational, a man with no requirement to perform. His gaze was moving across the room with quiet, deliberate purpose, not the roving attention of a guest taking stock of a party. The focused attention of a man looking for something he already expected to find. It found me. I felt it before I consciously understood it the moment his eyes reached the far end of the table and stopped moving. He took in my stained jacket, the bills strewn across the linen, the document beneath my hand. His face didn't betray much. No sharp intake of breath, no obvious reaction. But something passed behind his eyes, measured and cold, and absolutely certain. "Excuse me," he said to Nathan and moved around him. "Mr. Drummond." Nathan fell in behind him. "The main table is right this way. We have a place." "Give me a moment, Nathan." Not unkind, simply not open for discussion. He walked the full length of the dining room toward me. 30 guests tracked every step in collective bewilderment. This was not how Vincent Drummond was supposed to conduct himself at a dinner built entirely around impressing him. He was meant to accept the seat of honor, hold a glass of something excellent, and allow himself to be courted. He was not meant to walk past his host and cross the room to an old man sitting alone with food on his jacket. He stopped in front of me. Up close, the years were more visible, the lines at the corners of his eyes, a slight heaviness settling along the jaw. But the eyes themselves hadn't changed. Alert level, carrying the quality of a man who had known genuine fear and arrived somewhere steadier on the far side of it. He looked at my jacket. He looked at the bills on the table. He looked at the document. His jaw tightened, one small, controlled movement, and then nothing. "Russell," he said. Just the name. The way Cecile had spoken it from her wheelchair near the door, warm and unhurried, as though it had been held somewhere safe, and was now being returned. Something in my throat that had held all evening gave way without warning. Heat pressed behind my eyes. I pressed my molars together and breathed through it. Vincent, I got out. I had no idea you'd be here tonight. I know you didn't. He pulled out the chair directly beside me, not across the table, not at any polite remove, but right there close enough that his shoulder sat 18 inches from mine, and sat down. I heard about the party. I wanted to see you. From the head of the table, Vivica's voice came sharper than she'd intended it. Mr. Drummond, we have a place setting prepared at the main. I'm comfortable here, thank you. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on me. And the simple fact of a man with his standing choosing to look at me rather than away, it undid more of my composure than anything Vivica had managed all evening. My eyes burned hard. I blinked twice. "How are you?" Vincent asked, his voice low, meant for no one else. The question nearly broke me. It was so plain, so entirely human, so different in kind from everything that had been aimed at me across the past 2 hours that it took me a moment to find any words at all. "I've had better evenings," I said. Something moved in his expression, not quite a smile, but close enough to its neighborhood. He glanced down at the document under my hand, then back up at my face. "Don't sign that," he said. Low and direct, the same economy he'd always used when there was no time to waste words. "Vincent, I mean it, Russell. Don't sign anything tonight." He leaned in, dropping his voice another register. "I have some things I want to say to this room. Things I should have said long before tonight. I'd like your permission." My heart was knocking against my ribs again, but differently than before. Not the dread of bad news arriving. Something older, stranger, and harder to put a name to. I looked at this man who had walked past 50 people to sit beside me, who had brought his mother in a wheelchair, to a party he hadn't been invited to for reasons I was only beginning to understand. "Say what you need to say," I told him. Vincent Drummond nodded once. Then he rose, straightened his jacket, and turned to face the room. There are moments that announce themselves even as they are happening, not always because they are loud or dramatic, but because something in you recognizes that the ground is shifting and will not shift back. What happened next was one of those moments. It took less than 30 seconds. He stood at the far end of the table, my end, the end, where the unwanted had been seated, and held my gaze for a long beat with those steady gray eyes. Then, with no preamble, no announcement, no theater of any kind, he reached up and began unbuttoning his jacket. The room felt this before it understood it. A ripple moved through the guests' heads, tilting exchanges, cutting off mid-breath. The jacket was charcoal wool, beautifully made, the kind of garment whose quality is apparent without any declaration of it. He eased it from his shoulders, folded it once across his forearm, and extended it to his left. A young assistant who had slipped in quietly behind him stepped forward and received it. Then Vincent reached across the table and lifted a linen napkin, the heavy ones white and formal, monogrammed with a G in silver thread, and crouched down beside my chair. "Vincent." My voice came out rough. "You don't have to, Russell." He looked up at me from where he crouched, eyes level with mine, his voice low enough that it belonged only to the two of us. "Let me do this." He began to work at the sauce on my jacket carefully, deliberately, the way you tend to something that deserves to be tended. The dining room went utterly still. I could hear the candles. 30 guests, executives, investors, the assembled social architecture of Indianapolis's upper tier, watching a billionaire kneel at the side of an old man in a ruined jacket and clean his clothes, as though there were nothing more natural in the world. What happens next changed everything. I thought I understood about who was truly in that room and why. Before we get there, let me ask you something. If you ever sensed that someone close to you was quietly working against you, would you confront them the moment you knew? Or would you wait and let the truth find its own way to the surface? Everything in my throat had locked. The heat behind my eyes was so fierce, I tilted my face toward the ceiling and blinked hard and fast. The private maneuver of a person who absolutely refuses to weep in front of a room that has already taken enough from him tonight. What was making my hands shake against my legs wasn't the cold or my age. It was something more devastating than either the experience of being handled with care after a long stretch without it. Nathan pushed forward from somewhere at my right elbow, his voice tight and fraying at the edges. "Mr. Drummond, I don't think this isn't necessary. My father is Nathan." Vincent never glanced up. His tone was cordial and completely immovable. "I'll be with you shortly." Nathan went still. From down at the far end, I could feel Vivica's attention fixed on the scene with the coiled focus of a woman watching her carefully built evening tip toward disaster. Then Cecile Drummond's voice drifted in from the dining room entrance, unhurried, warm, pitched for the whole room. "Vincent has been waiting 25 years for a moment like this," she said to everyone and to no one specifically. "He'll take whatever time he needs." Vincent finished what he was doing. He rose, folded the napkin back onto the table, and looked down at me with an expression I do not have adequate words for, and have been reaching for words for ever since. Not pity, I'd have pulled away from pity. Not guilt, though I suspected a thread of that was woven into him somewhere. What I saw was grief and gratitude knotted into each other, the face of a man who has been carrying something unrepaid for 25 years and has finally found his moment. "How long has this been going on?" His voice was low, just mine to hear. I gave a small shake of my head. Tonight is its own particular situation. I don't mean tonight." Something moved through his jaw. "How long have they been treating you this way?" There was a pressure sitting in my chest that had nothing physiological about it. I looked down at the tablecloth, the crumpled bills Nathan had left, where they fell, the unsigned document with the ghost of my grip still pressed into the top page. "Long enough," I told him. Vincent gave one slow nod, weighted like a ruling. He straightened and turned to face the room. No glass raised, no performative throat clearing. He simply turned, and the room arranged itself around the fact of his attention, not because anyone feared him, but because the people who had been in enough rooms recognized when something honest was about to be spoken aloud. "My name is Vincent Drummond," he said. "Some of you will know that name. For those who don't, I'm the founder and chief executive of Drummond Global. We operate across 14 states. We employ just under 4,000 people. One beat. Let it breathe. I didn't come tonight because Nathan Greer put me on a guest list. I came because this man—" The gesture toward me was small and unhurried and left no room for ambiguity. "Is owed something I have been trying for years to calculate and have never been able to fully repay. Word reached me that he'd be here." From the far end of the table, Nathan produced a sound, not language, just the noise of a man trying to object before he'd decided what the objection was. Vincent gave it no space. 25 years back, he said I was 30 years old with nothing left to show. Whatever I'd tried to build had come apart. And my mother here, the quality of his voice shifted, tightened around the word, was sick in a way that required money I did not have. I'd been to every bank in Indianapolis. I'd been to every investor I knew how to reach. Every single one of them had turned me away, and time was the one thing I was genuinely out of. A pause. The room wasn't breathing. "I went to find Russell Greer," he said, "not because we had any particular history, but because someone whose judgment I trusted told me he was a man whose word meant something. When you are as close to the bottom as I was, a man whose word means something is the most valuable thing in the world to you." I walked in and told him everything. Pride wasn't something I could afford anymore. A brief sound, almost a laugh, almost not. He listened. He put 2 questions to me, and then he told me to return the next morning. He turned his gaze to me then, and I felt it land with the full weight of what he was about to ask. "Russell," he said, "would you like to tell them yourself, or should I?" When I found my voice, it was calmer than I had any business expecting. "You go ahead," I said. "You've always told it better than I have." Something very faint moved at the corner of Vincent's mouth. He turned back to his audience. The following morning, he said Russell Greer brought me the mortgage papers on his house on Hawthorne Ridge Road. Overnight, he had arranged for that property to serve as collateral on a loan large enough to put my company back on its feet. He wanted nothing in exchange. No stake in the business, no interest, no contractual protection of any kind, only my word. He paused. This man put everything he and his wife had spent their lives building on a stranger's shoulders because he had decided that stranger deserved the chance. Nobody in the room was making a sound. "That house," Vincent said, and his voice had gone somewhere quieter and more deliberate, "is the same house that the document sitting on this table tonight would have him surrender." When those words arrived, that house, the same house, I felt the air in the room change before I fully understood why. Something physical. The kind of pressure drop you register in your chest before a storm breaks. 30 people silently rearranging everything they'd been certain of an hour ago. But by then, I had stopped tracking the room. Vincent's voice was still there, even and measured, but I had traveled somewhere else the way you do when a thing you've held privately for a long time gets spoken aloud, and the speaking pulls you down into the moment it came from. 25 years. The winter of 1998. My College Avenue office was tight back then. Nothing like the Massachusetts Avenue location I'd moved to later, second-floor window overlooking a concrete parking deck. A radiator that registered its complaints every 20 minutes from October clear through to March. I had 2 employees and a used Chevy pickup with Greer Logistics painted on the side, in letters I'd stenciled myself, and enough regional contract work to stay afloat without ever feeling settled. Vincent had phoned ahead. He came in a Tuesday morning. I remember it was Tuesday because the radiator had been in a particularly foul mood. His coat was presentable but too light for the weather. His face wore the particular depletion of a man who has stopped sleeping properly and learned to function around the gap. He took the chair across from mine and laid out the whole picture, the company, what he owed his mother's medical bills, the banks, and what they'd said, each refusal described without self-pity, in a voice that stayed even from first word to last. That steadiness told me more about him than the details did. A man keeping himself intact through discipline alone, while the scaffolding fell away around him. When he finished, he held my gaze across the desk and said, "I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for a chance. If you help me use your property as collateral, I will pay back every dollar the bank extends plus interest, and I will spend the rest of my career making sure this was worth your risk." 2 questions. The first, do you believe in what you're building? He said yes, and his eyes didn't shift. The second, if it comes apart anyway, can you live with having tried it honestly? He sat with that one. Then, yes. I think so. I told him to come back in the morning. That same evening I sat down with Loretta. We were at the kitchen table on Hawthorne Ridge Road, the same table where I'd sat 3 days ago with my coffee and her photograph in front of me. She didn't interrupt once. Loretta listened the way very few people actually listen fully, without saving half her attention for her own reply. And it was one of the things about her I never stopped being grateful for. When I finished, she held the silence for a moment. Then, "Russell, do you believe him?" I think so, I said. Do you believe in him? I turned over the memory of how Vincent's eyes had stayed level when he answered. Yes. Loretta moved her hand across the table and covered mine. Her fingers were always warm, even mid-January, even when the house was cold. Then we help him, she said. We have the house. What is a house for if not this? I held onto her hand and left the thought where it was because she had completed it, and there was nothing honest left to add. Back in that dining room, in the harsh light, with its white calla lilies and the wreckage of the evening, Vincent's voice drew me back up to the surface, the way an arm reaches down through still water. Loretta Greer, he was telling the room, and hearing her name spoken aloud in that space drove something sharp and tender straight through the center of my chest. She told her husband that a house was only as valuable as the use you put it to. She had put her name on those papers right alongside Russell's, both signatures without a moment's hesitation. I pressed the heel of my hand against my breastbone and drew a slow breath. My company came back, Vincent went on. More than came back. The loan was repaid in 4 years ahead of schedule. I sent Russell a check for double the interest owed. He returned it. A beat of silence. The following year, I tried again. He sent that one back as well. He said Vincent glanced at me, a question folded into the look. I told him he'd already paid me, I said. My voice came out scoured rougher than I'd meant it to. The loan was settled. That was the full extent of what we'd agreed to. He said the debt was cleared, and so it was. Vincent faced the room again. That is the measure of Russell Greer as a man. He doesn't tally kindness in a ledger. He doesn't extend a hand and then dangle that extension above you for the rest of your days. Something in his voice had acquired an edge, not exactly anger, but something running alongside it, something with temperature. He does what he believes is right, and then steps back and lets you live. He doesn't collect on what he's given. He doesn't bring it back up. Vincent stopped for a moment, gathered himself, and I watched his throat move as he swallowed. He just goes on being who he is without ceremony, without asking to be seen. The room had gone so quiet that Cecile's breathing was audible from her wheelchair near the entrance. Nathan's chair scraped back an inch. When he spoke, his voice had dropped, and something in it had fractured. Dad, I didn't know. I knew you'd helped people, I knew that, but I didn't know it was the house. I looked straight at my son for the first time in several minutes. I kept my voice level and clean. Yeah, you knew about the house, Nathan. You grew up there. You understood what it took to hold on to it. Something moved across his face, a brief involuntary collapse like a structure absorbing a load it wasn't built to carry. His eyes went bright and wet, and he turned away. Vivica's voice came across the moment like something mechanical, engaging. This is all very moving, but I fail to see what any of this ancient history has to do with tonight. It has everything to do with tonight. Vincent turned to face her fully for the first time, and the quality of his attention, as it landed on her, was entirely different from how it had rested on me. The warmth was gone from it. What remained was precise and stripped of any sentiment. And we are far from finished, Mrs. Greer. He reached into the interior pocket of his jacket, the one his assistant was holding, and brought out his phone. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at Vivica. I believe he said it's time for this room to hear about the psychiatric evaluation. Vincent did not play the recording. He slid the phone away. His assistant offered back the jacket, without needing to be asked, the two of them moving with the quiet efficiency of people who have worked alongside each other long enough to need no signal, and he settled it over his shoulders. Then he turned toward Nathan with an expression I can only describe as deliberate patience, the kind a man practices when he has several things to say and intends each one to arrive with its full weight. Before we get to that, Vincent said, I want to be certain everyone in this room has a clear picture of what was actually being assembled tonight, because some significant context has been absent from the proceedings. Nathan straightened. Since the moment his face had buckled during Vincent's account of the mortgage, his color had never fully come back. He still looked pale and slightly hollowed, the way someone looks when a story about their parents turns out to be far larger and costlier than they had ever allowed themselves to understand. Mr. Drummond, I appreciate what you've shared, but matters like this between family members, I don't think you should be involved. Vincent's response was not unkind, but it was a door and it was closing. Please. Nathan pressed his lips flat and reached for his wine glass with a hand that was not entirely under control. Vincent turned to face the room, and I noticed that the guests who had been shifting in their chairs throughout the evening had gone perfectly still. No one was looking at a phone. No one was flagging a server. Every face was aimed at Vincent Drummond with the concentrated attention of people who have understood all at once that they are in the middle of something they will still be talking about years from now. 3 years ago, Vincent said Nathan and Vivica Greer moved into this house. A fine property, 5 bedrooms, 4 bathrooms, just under 6,000 square feet, assessed at approximately $2.4 million. A pause. My Nathan, do you know who owns it? Nathan's jaw went tight. I do. The deed carries my name. Your name appears on the deed as beneficiary. Vincent said that is not the same thing as ownership. Under American property law, a beneficiary is the party who enjoys the use and the benefits of a property. The actual legal owner, the entity holding the power to encumber it, transfer it, or revoke it, is the trust. He let his eyes travel across the table. A trust is a legal arrangement in which one party, the grantor, transfers assets to a trustee to hold and manage on behalf of another. The grantor retains certain rights depending on the structure of the arrangement. He brought his gaze back to Nathan. The grantor of the trust holding this property, Vincent said, is Russell Greer, your father. He established it in 2018. He is also the sole trustee. The room took this in the way deep water takes a stone, not with a splash, but with a slow, widening displacement that altered everything beneath the surface. Nathan's wine glass stopped moving. His eyes came to me, and what was in them I had not seen since he was a teenager, raw and unguarded, all the careful polish of 2 decades stripped back in an instant. Dad, he said. Dad is that. Yes, I said. My voice stayed quiet but held its shape. I set up the trust when your company was beginning to show real growth. I wanted you to have solid footing under you regardless of how the market moved. But I structured it as a trust rather than a direct transfer because I stopped. Looked at my hands, then back at him. Because I wanted you to have a home, Nathan. Not something to borrow against. His throat moved. His eyes were glassy now, that particular brightness that appears in people who have spent years training themselves against tears and are suddenly losing the fight. You never told me, he said, and the last word split apart at the seam. You never asked about the paperwork, I said. The lawyers put documents in front of you, you signed them, you moved in. I assumed you had a full picture. I didn't. He set his glass down harder than intended, a sharp knock against the cloth. I thought it ran through the business. I didn't understand it was yours. Vivica's voice arrived, then blade-thin, quick. This is completely beside the point. The trust arrangement is a private family matter and has no bearing on... It has direct bearing, Vincent said, pivoting toward her with a precision that sent several nearby guests back in their chairs by a fraction. On the document your husband presented to his father 40 minutes ago. A property transfer agreement requires the grantor's free and voluntary consent. Since Russell is both grantor and trustee of the trust that holds this property, any transfer he signed under duress, in a setting where he had been publicly humiliated, physically struck with food, and subjected to coercive ultimatums, would be vulnerable to challenge in court as the product of undue influence. He tilted his head a degree, which I suspect your legal team either failed to advise you of or chose not to mention. Vivica's face had drained to the color of the white calla lilies on the table. Her mouth came open. Undue influence, Vincent continued, for those in the room who may be less familiar with the term, is a legal doctrine that empowers courts to void contracts or transfers when one party has applied improper pressure to override another's free will. Indiana courts treat it seriously, particularly in cases involving elderly individuals and family members in positions of trust. He held Vivica's gaze. I thought you should know that. A sound came from Nathan. Not words, something more involuntary than words. A low, ragged exhale pulled up from somewhere far below speech. He pressed both palms flat against the table and fixed his eyes on the cloth, and his shoulders shook once hard, the way a wall shakes when something load-bearing inside it lets go. Nathan. The word left me before I'd decided to say it. Hearing my son come apart like that even now, even with those crumpled bills still scattered across the linen between us, sent something cold and sharp straight through me, because he was still my son. That was not a fact I had any power to alter. Nathan, look at me. He raised his eyes. They were wet. His jaw clenched hard with the effort of holding himself together in front of a room that had watched him drop money on his father less than an hour ago. I am not your enemy, I told him. I never was. His face gave way completely, a fast, silent unraveling, everything he'd been holding up at once coming down, and he pressed his hand over his mouth and turned toward the window. Vivica moved one step in his direction. Then she stopped because Vincent had drawn his phone back out, and something in the room's attention reconfigured a tightening, a collective held breath, and whatever she had been building toward dissolved before it reached her lips. Now, Vincent said, and his voice had dropped to something very measured. The recording. I want to tell you I was braced for whatever Vincent was about to play. I want to tell you that after the preceding 2 hours, the food poured across my back. The crumpled bills, the contract, all of it, I had arrived somewhere beyond the reach of further damage. That would be a lie. Vincent raised his phone angled so the speaker faced outward and pressed play. Vivica's voice came through that small device with a clarity that felt almost clinical. She was speaking quickly with the compressed efficiency of a woman in the middle of conducting business background noise suggesting a car or corridor. The evaluation needs to be completed before the holidays, she said. I need documentation showing cognitive decline, confusion, memory gaps, difficulty with complex decisions. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to support a capacity hearing. A man's voice responded lower, harder to make out. That's not standard practice if the subject hasn't been properly assessed. He's 68 years old and he lives alone, Vivica said, and her tone had acquired the particular edge of someone explaining the obvious to someone not keeping up. His wife passed away 6 years ago. He has no regular physician of record in Marion County. There's no one positioned to dispute the findings. A pause. Then the man again. What kind of timeline are we talking? Before Thanksgiving, Vivica said. I need the paperwork ready. Once we have a signed evaluation showing diminished capacity, we can file for conservatorship. At that point, all financial decisions, accounts, property, any outstanding guarantees or business arrangements transfer to Nathan's management. It becomes a matter of probate court, not negotiation. The recording ended. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I have ever been inside. I sat without moving. My hands rested in my lap. My heart was doing something off, not painful, but wrong. The rhythm slightly displaced the way a clock sounds when something small inside it has come loose. I was aware of my own breathing in the way I hadn't been since the moment the doctors found me in the hospital waiting room 6 years ago, and I read in the way they walked what they were coming to say. Diminished capacity, cognitive decline, memory gaps. She had sat somewhere in this city and described me. Russell Greer, who had built a company from nothing and managed its ledgers for 30 years, who had read every contract twice before signing, who could still recall the interest rate on a loan arranged in 1998 as a confused old man who could no longer be trusted with his own life. And she had engaged someone to put that portrait on paper and sign it. My throat had constricted to the point where breathing required conscious intention. I pressed my back teeth together and fixed my eyes on the centerpiece white calla lilies, their petals absurdly immaculate, and I breathed in through my nose and out through my mouth. I did not fall apart in that room, because falling apart was the entire destination she had been steering me toward all evening, and I refused absolutely to hand her the footage. Vincent's voice came back even deliberate. A psychiatric evaluation, for those unfamiliar with what that process involves, is an assessment carried out by a licensed mental health professional to determine whether an individual retains the cognitive capacity to make their own legal and financial decisions. In Indiana, a fraudulent evaluation, one prepared without genuine examination of the subject, or built on falsified findings, constitutes a criminal offense. Specifically, it can give rise to charges of fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy to commit financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. He looked at Vivica with the unhurried steadiness of a man who has nowhere else to be. Financial exploitation of the elderly, he continued, is treated with particular gravity under state law. Indiana Revised Code, Section 2913 covers theft by deception. Section 2903.34 covers patient abuse and neglect. Federal wire fraud statutes apply when electronic communications, phone calls, for instance, are used to advance the scheme. He paused. I have this recording because the individual Vivica contacted to conduct the evaluation came to me instead. He had worked alongside Drummond Global's legal team on a prior matter and understood that what he was being asked to do required disclosure. Vivica's chest was moving too fast. Her hands were pressed flat against the tablecloth, the way mine had been earlier in the evening, though, where I had done it to hold myself steady. She was doing it to contain something surging up from below. Her face had moved past pale into something nearly translucent. That's... Her voice came out stripped of its usual precision. That recording is, you can't, that was a private conversation, and whatever you think you... Vivica. Nathan's voice was low, broken somewhere at its base. The voice of a man standing in what used to be a structure. Vivica, stop. She turned toward him. Nathan, this man is trying to... Stop. He said it again, and this time it carried no room for anything else. His eyes were red at the rims, his jaw working against something large and ungovernable. Please, just stop talking. Something crossed Vivica's face, quick and ugly, a fracture running through the surface, and she pressed her lips together until they whitened at the edges. I looked at my son. He was staring at the tablecloth with both hands covering his face, elbows on the table, shoulders pulled up and locked rigid with the effort of making no sound. He was shaking. I could see it from 15 feet away, a fine, continuous trembling through his shoulders and arms. The physical expression of a man whose entire constructed world is coming apart beneath him. I wanted to go to him. That is the plain truth of it. Even then, even in a stained jacket with the sound of Vivica's voice arranging my incapacitation still hanging in that room, something in me that could not be argued with wanted to cross those 15 feet, put my hand on his shoulder, and tell him it would be all right. But it was not all right, and saying otherwise would have been its own kind of cruelty. Vincent turned from Vivica to address the room at large. Several guests had placed their phones on the table, not to record anything, simply present, as though they needed the familiar weight of them close. The gray-haired man who had nearly spoken up earlier sat with his hands clasped on the cloth in front of him, his expression set in something heavier than discomfort. "I have one more thing to bring before this room," Vincent said. He glanced at me with a brief look, a question in it, a courtesy extended, and I gave him the smallest nod. Something Russell doesn't know I'm about to say, because he never told me himself. I came to know it through my own investigation, and I believe the people in this room deserve to understand the full picture of the man they are actually gathered around tonight. Vincent put the phone away. He straightened his cuffs, a small, unhurried motion that somehow instructed the room to wait, and then he looked at me with an expression that held apology and resolve in equal portions. "Russell," Vincent said, "I'm going to tell them something you never shared with anyone. If you'd rather I didn't say so now." My chest pulled tight. I had a fair sense of what was coming. I had kept it to myself for the same reason I kept most things to myself, not from shame, but because I had never believed that doing right by someone required anyone else to watch. "Say what you need to say," I told him, the same words as before. They still held. Vincent turned to the room. Last month specifically, the third week of October, Greer Development, Nathan's company, was facing a called loan. A called loan occurs when a lender demands full and immediate repayment of an outstanding debt before its scheduled maturity, typically triggered by the borrower's breach of agreed loan covenants. Greer Development had missed 2 consecutive quarterly financial benchmarks. The bank was within its rights to demand immediate repayment of approximately $800,000. He paused. "Let it settle." Without that payment, Greer Development would have entered default proceedings within 30 days. Bankruptcy would have followed not long after. Vincent's delivery was factual and unhurried, the voice of a man recounting something he has gone over enough times to have it memorized. I know this because my team was approached as a potential emergency investor. We reviewed the financials in full. The situation was not one that conventional investment could resolve. Too much had landed too fast, compressed into too small a window. Nathan had seized up entirely, spine, straight hands, pressed flat against the tablecloth, his complexion drained to that ashen, bloodless shade you see on a man receiving terrible news in front of witnesses. "We declined," Vincent said. But someone else did not. His eyes came to rest on me. In the 3 weeks prior to this dinner, Russell Greer had walked into First Meridian Bank of Indiana and signed a personal guarantee against the outstanding debt carried by Greer Development. What that means in practical terms is that a person stakes their own wealth savings, real estate, any asset of consequence as collateral for someone else's obligation. Had the company gone under, Russell would have been on the hook, personally, for the entire $800,000. Something passed through the room, not language, something older and more involuntary. A breath pulled collectively from several directions, at once the sound a group makes when it absorbs something it wasn't prepared for. He had asked the bank, Vincent went on, to strip his name from every piece of paperwork that reached Nathan. He didn't want his son finding out. Vincent's jaw drew tight for just a moment. The man at the far end of this table, the one you watched, absorb a plate of food tonight. The one who sat here while his own son flung money at him, that same man had gone quietly to a bank 3 weeks ago and put his name on the line to keep his son's company breathing. Then he walked through that door tonight carrying a gift. The silence that followed had mass to it, a pressure you could almost feel against your skin. Nathan produced a sound, not a word, something that had no name, hollow and airless, as though it had risen from somewhere deeper than speech. His hand came up fast and covered his mouth. His eyes, already raw and swollen, gave way completely, tears sliding free before he could marshal any defense tracing openly down his face, with nothing to hold them back. His shoulders lurched once-twice. He ground his fist into his mouth with such force the knuckles blanched. "Dad." What passed for his voice in that moment was barely distinguishable from silence. "Dad, I swear to God, I didn't know." "I know," I said. "I know you didn't." My throat felt like it had been scraped hollow. My eyes were stinging and full. I pressed my back molars together and kept breathing. "I didn't want you to know. See, it wasn't your decision to carry." "Why?" It came out of him like something torn loose, uneven, stripped raw. "Why after all of it? Why would you still? You're my son." My voice gave slightly on that last word, a hairline fracture just audible. "There doesn't need to be another reason." Nathan put his face in his hands and broke. Not in any quiet or dignified way. He wept the way a 40-year-old man weeps when the full accounting of what he squandered arrives all at once, with nothing held back, nothing managed. His whole frame shook. The sound was real and ragged, the kind that comes when truth makes contact, the way a blow does. Around him, several guests turned their eyes elsewhere, not out of discomfort, but because some grief deserves to be witnessed without being watched. Vincent gave it a beat. Then his attention moved deliberately down the length of the table to a heavy-set man in his late 50s who had occupied the chair beside Nathan's seat of honor since the evening began. He'd been the one laughing hardest at Vivica's remarks all night, the one whose glass was never empty long, the one who had announced himself to at least 3 people as a significant force in Midwest commercial development. "Mr. Kellaway," Vincent said, with the ease of someone who'd rehearsed none of this. The man lifted his eyes. Something moved across his fleshy, self-assured face, a ripple of unease he couldn't quite suppress. "Mr. Drummond, I understand you're seated here tonight as a prospective investor in Greer Development." Kellaway pulled himself a little straighter. "That's correct. Nathan and I have been in talks about—" "You stepped down from Westfield Capital Partners last Tuesday," Vincent said. "The firm is under SEC scrutiny for misrepresenting fund performance to institutional investors. Your name turned up in the preliminary filing 48 hours ago," a slight tilt of the head. "I thought the other guests at Nathan's table deserved to have that information before any investment conversation went further." Kellaway's face did something remarkable in the span of a few seconds, cycling through red, then a deeper, angrier red, then a shade that bordered on purple. His chair scraped back hard. "Those allegations are they're unsubstantiated, and my legal team has already been, naturally," Vincent said, wearing the particular composure of someone for whom the outcome is no longer in question. "That sounds like a matter better handled elsewhere." Kellaway left his napkin on the table, got to his feet, and said nothing to anyone. He covered the distance to the exit with that distinctive, rigid stride, a man working hard to look unhurried, while evacuating as quickly as he could manage, without breaking into an outright run. The 2 guests closest to him traded a glance. One of them quietly retrieved his jacket from where it hung behind him. The shape of the evening was disintegrating. I felt it the way you register a drop in pressure before a storm arrives, every person in that room quietly revising their understanding of where they were and what they'd walked into. And at the center of it, my son hadn't moved. His face was still buried in his hands. He was weeping the way I hadn't witnessed since he was 7 years old, back when he'd shattered something beyond repair. I spotted the young man with the phone before Vincent did. 22 at most, sitting 3 seats down from my end of the table. Not someone Nathan did business with, more likely a son or nephew of someone who was dragged along as a +1 to what had turned out to be a very different kind of evening than the invite suggested. He'd been looking at his phone for several minutes, but with none of the idle, half-present quality of someone passing time. His gaze was locked on the screen, mouth slightly open. The expression of a person watching something unfold that they cannot bring themselves to look away from. He angled toward the woman beside him and spoke low enough to stay private, just loud enough to bleed past the edge. It's still live. She left it running. There's 47,000 people watching right now. She looked at his screen. Her hand moved to her mouth. Vincent caught it. I watched something shift in him, not astonishment, but a focused sharpening, the look of a man who's just realized he's been handed additional leverage. He turned his attention to Vivica's assistant, still stationed near the kitchen doorway, holding her phone loosely, now her posture carrying the stiffness of someone who has begun to understand what the device in her hand has become. "Is that stream still going?" Vincent asked her directly, no softness in it. The assistant glanced toward Vivica. Vivica's mouth was tight, her eyes darting between Vincent, between the assistant, between the young man's screen, the fast-cornered arithmetic of someone watching their own design collapse around them. "Answer him." Vincent set his focus, staying on the assistant, the words carrying the unhurried weight of a man for whom being answered is simply the natural order. The assistant's throat moved. "Yes," she managed. Yes, it's still running." Vincent gave one nod contained, confirming the nod of a man who'd already known. Then he squared himself toward the room with a steadiness I genuinely could not have manufactured in that moment. "For anyone watching this from somewhere else," he said, his voice opening up, just slightly angled now, toward the wider audience he knew was there. "You have been present for everything I've described. Live. The scarf this man brought for his son left in a wastebasket. The container with his name written on it beforehand. The food across his jacket, the dollar bills, the contract." A pause. "And you've heard the recording." Every bit of it went out on a platform this woman switched on herself to be used as a weapon against the man you've been watching all night. Vivica moved quickly, more quickly than I'd anticipated, 4 long strides across the room, reaching for the phone. The assistant flinched and pulled away on instinct, and the phone went down. It caught the corner of the serving cart, skipped across it, and landed on the marble with a crack, the screen splitting but staying lit. 2 seats over, a guest already had his own phone up, not the stream. His own recording, his own vantage. The room was generating its own documentation, now the way rooms do when enough people sense that what they're seeing is significant and may one day need to be proved. No coordination required, no signal given. Vivica crouched and pulled the assistant's phone from the floor. 2 hard jabs at the screen with her thumb and the stream cut. But her face in that moment, and I believe everyone in that room read it the same way I did. Told the whole story, she already understood that what had broadcast could not be unmade. "That was taken completely out of context," she said. The control in her voice was slipping, still reaching for that familiar crispness, but landing somewhere thinner and faster, the sound of something under too much tension. "Everything tonight, Russell, has been confused. And Vivica..." The gray-haired man beside me said something for the first time all evening. He looked to be around 70, carrying himself with the upright, deliberate bearing of a man with a military background, someone who weighed each word before committing to it. He was the one I'd noticed back at table 5, the one who had half opened his mouth and then decided against it. He wasn't deciding against it now. "I've spent 40 years in business," he said. "And I know exactly what I just watched. Don't stand there and tell us we misread what we witnessed. Vivica opened her mouth and shut it again. The gray-haired man pushed back his chair and got to his feet. He fastened a single button on his jacket with the deliberateness of a man closing a chapter, then looked at Nathan. He said he had come tonight because he was weighing a substantial investment in Nathan's expansion plans. He would not be making that investment. His gaze crossed mine for just a moment, and something moved through his expression. Not pity, something with considerably more backbone than pity. Something closer to respect, offered plainly and without theater. "Good evening, Russell." Then he left. Two guests fell in behind him at once, no discussion required, as though they'd simply been waiting for someone to go first. Then a third. Then a couple rising together, the woman laying a hand on her husband's arm as they stood. Nathan watched every one of them go. With each person who buttoned their jacket and moved toward that door, something inside him seemed to give way, not merely hope, but something more load-bearing than hope. The way a structure fails when the supports go one by one. His hands were still resting on the table, but the weeping had stopped. He had moved through tears and arrived somewhere on the other side, quieter, more alarming. The blank, slightly stunned look of a man in the immediate aftermath of disaster, when the true scale of it is still traveling toward him and the body is simply waiting for it to arrive. "Nathan," Vivica said, her voice dropping, stripped of its gloss, reaching for him with something like urgency. "Nathan, we can manage this. We just need to—" "Don't." His voice had gone hollow and flat. "Please, don't tell me what we need right now." I sat at my end of the table and watched my son's life disassemble itself one departure at a time, and what I felt was not what I had imagined I would feel. Not vindication, not any species of relief, but a grief that went down to the bone for the boy Nathan had been and the man he had elected to become. And beneath that, something quieter, still the recognition that the evening was nearly done, and that what followed it was mine to determine. I have not lived an easy life in terms of decisions. I have put my name on contracts that stole 3 nights of sleep from me beforehand. I have closed out business partnerships that had been standing for decades. I have sat in a hospital room with 2 physicians and a chaplain, and agreed to let my wife leave this world gently, rather than stretch her suffering out by another week. None of those choices felt like this one. I pushed my chair back. The scrape of the legs on marble was not loud, but in that particular room at that particular moment, it was more than sufficient. Every head still in the room turned toward me. Perhaps 15 guests remained. The others had located their reasons to be elsewhere. I stood up. 68-year-old sauce from earlier dried into my jacket, my back carrying the complaint of 3 hours in a chair built for shorter evenings. I straightened myself the way my father had drilled into me, shoulders back, chin level, the bearing of a man who has not been made smaller by what was done to him. Nathan looked up from the table. His eyes were devastated, raw and swollen, the eyes of a man who has wept himself empty and is now living in the scraped-out quiet that follows. When he spoke, his voice was just above nothing. "Dad." Only that one word, but it was carrying everything he couldn't organize into sentences. "Nathan." I reached into my jacket pocket and drew out my phone. My hands were steady. That surprised me. I had been braced for trembling, but they were still the way hands go still when a decision has already been made and the body recognizes that shaking would accomplish nothing. "I need to make a call." He sat up slightly. "Dad, please just let me explain." "You don't need to explain the dollar bills," I said. "I understand what those were. You wanted me gone and you chose the most direct route available." I held my voice level, not cold level. "There is a distinction worth keeping. What I want you to sit with while I make this call isn't what you did tonight. It's why you believed you could. A long pause stretched between us. His jaw shifted. He pressed his lips together and gave a small, broken nod. I dialed Philip Calder, my attorney of 22 years, the man who had guided me through the sale of Greer Logistics, through Loretta's estate, through the trust documents drawn up for this very house. He answered on the second ring the way Philip always answered when I called at an hour like this. That was simply the kind of attorney he was. Russell. Immediate alertness in his voice. Philip had a lawyer's ear for calls that arrive at the wrong time. Is everything all right? Not entirely, I said. Philip, I need to start the process tonight of withdrawing the personal guarantee on Greer Development's bank loan. I want the notice drafted and submitted to First Meridian Bank of Indiana first thing tomorrow morning. A pause. Russell, are you certain if the guarantee is withdrawn, the bank will very likely call the loan within? I understand what will happen, I said. I've thought it through. Please go ahead. A shorter pause. All right. I'll have the paperwork ready by 7 a.m. Do you want me to? Just the notice for now. We'll speak in the morning. I paused. Thank you, Philip. I ended the call. I stood there a moment with the phone in my hand. Eyes on the middle distance somewhere in the room I would not be coming back to, and I breathed. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The old method. The one Loretta had taught me. Dad. Nathan's voice had shifted registers. The shock had fractured into something more desperate, something with an edge of panic to it. He pushed back his chair and began to rise. Dad, the company, if the guarantee is pulled, the bank, I have employees, there are people who… I know, I said. Then how can you… Nathan. I looked at my son straight on, not with anger, not with the quiet satisfaction of a man landing the verdict he'd been constructing all evening, but with sorrow. Real sorrow, the kind that has no performance in it. The sorrow of a father who has loved imperfectly and been failed imperfectly and is standing now in what both of those things built together. I have shielded you from the consequences of your own choices for a very long time. I said it slowly, one thought at a time. Tonight I watched you throw money at me. I watched you put a contract in front of me to sign in front of witnesses who were capturing it for use in a legal filing against me. And I watched you stand next to your wife while she poured food over me and described me to this room as confused. My voice thickened slightly on the last word. I didn't try to smooth it over. I'm not going to go on protecting you from yourself. That is not what love is. It never was. Nathan's legs seemed to stop trusting themselves. He sank back into his chair, both hands flat on the table, his chest working with the effort of breathing through something that had no easy way out. Vivica moved in from somewhere to my right. Her voice had shed every layer of social finish. What was underneath was raw and urgent. Russell, if you pull that guarantee, the company collapses. Nathan loses everything. You would actually do that to your own son. I looked at her. Fully this time, the way I had been careful not to all evening, taking in the complete picture of the woman Nathan had chosen and the accumulated cost of that choosing. Vivica, I said, the company was already in failure before I came in last month. I bought it more time. What your husband chose to do with that time specifically tonight is not something another check from me is going to correct. I crossed to the wastebasket beside the serving cart. I reached in and took out Loretta's scarf. The green wool had a slight crease in it, but was otherwise unmarked. I folded it the way I had folded it 3 days ago at the kitchen table on Hawthorne Ridge Road, and I placed it in my jacket pocket. Vincent was watching me from across the room. He gave me the smallest of nods, not approval acknowledgement, because he understood that this was not a moment that called for approval. I moved toward the front of the house. Behind me, I heard Nathan say my name once more. I heard it the way you hear something. You know you'll be carrying with you for the rest of your life completely, with nothing lost, the sound of it lodged somewhere that doesn't fade. I didn't turn around. Not because I had stopped loving him, because I had finally, at 68 years old, learned the difference between love and rescue. And I was finished with the rescuing. The drive home ran to 40 minutes. I know because I tracked the clock on the dashboard the way you fix on something neutral when the rest of your mind needs somewhere else to be, while it works through what just happened. The November dark pressed itself against the windshield. Indianapolis passed around me the way it always does, gas stations, traffic signals, the late-night geometry of a city that keeps its own pace and makes no allowances for anyone's private devastation. I kept both hands on the wheel. I held to the speed limit. I left the radio off because I had no use for sound. What I wanted was that specific quality of silence you only get inside a car moving through the dark, a silence that exists apart from everything outside the glass. Loretta's scarf was on the passenger seat next to me. I'd taken it from my jacket pocket and set it there when I got in, the way I used to put things on that seat when she was still alive, her handbag, her library books, the grocery lists she wrote in that careful left-leaning hand of hers. It was a habit I'd never managed to shake. 6 years on that seat still felt like it belonged to someone. I pieced together what happened after I left, the way you usually piece things together in the wake of a hard evening in fragments from different sources over the days that followed. Vincent phoned the next morning. He'd stayed until the final guest had gone, he said, because he wanted to be certain the night ended without anything further igniting. His voice was measured and factual, the voice of someone delivering a summary, not dramatizing events. After you walked out, he told me, the room held for about 90 seconds. Then Franklin Wexler, the older gentleman who had been seated near you, the one who spoke up, he shook my hand, said goodnight to Cecile, and left. After that, it moved quickly. How quickly? I asked. 12 minutes, Vincent said. Everyone out except 2 couples who stayed to help the serving staff, which tells you everything you need to know. I sat with those 12 minutes with the sound of chairs scraping back, jackets being reclaimed, the particular rhythm of an evening ending. Not in warmth or goodwill, but in the quiet collective verdict of people who have seen something they are unwilling to sanction. What did Nathan do? I asked. Vincent paused. He sat at the table, he said, made no attempt to stop anyone from leaving. By that point, Vincent thought Nathan had grasped that there was nothing left worth saving. I pressed the heel of my hand to my sternum. The ache there had not softened overnight. And Vivica? She tried, Vincent said, his voice carrying a dry precision that told me he had not been moved by the attempt. She followed 2 of the departing guests as far as the entrance, and told them the evening had been misrepresented, that important context was missing. One of them, a woman Vincent didn't recognize, stopped, looked at Vivica and said quietly, Vivica, I watched that man take his wife's scarf out of your trash can. There is no context for that. Then she walked out. Something in my throat closed sharply at that. A stranger had grasped the significance of what Vivica had discarded more readily than my own son had, at least through the first half of the evening. I was grateful to that woman, whoever she was. Vincent spoke for another 10 minutes. He told me that First Meridian Bank of Indiana had received Philip Calder's preliminary notice at 6:58 in the morning and had already reached out to Greer Development's accounts team. He told me that 2 of Nathan's investment partners had sent formal letters of withdrawal by email before 9 a.m., citing the events of the previous evening and what Vincent chose to call, with some delicacy, questions about the company's leadership culture. He told me that Cecile sent her regards and hoped I was getting some rest. Are you? He asked. Resting. Not particularly, I said. That was the honest answer. I had not slept. I'd arrived back at Hawthorne Ridge Road at 11:15 and sat in the kitchen for a long while at the same table where I'd finished Loretta's scarf 3 days before, where I'd taken Nathan's phone call that Monday morning, carrying what had briefly felt like something close to hope. I brewed coffee I never touched. I sat inside the specific quiet that belongs to a house with only one person in it. And then I did something I had not done sitting at my own kitchen table since the night the hospital called 6 years ago. I put my face in my hands, and I wept. Not with the managed, contained grief of a man holding himself together in front of others. I cried the way Nathan had cried at that dinner table, with the full, unguarded force of it, no dignity, preserved nothing held in check. I cried for Loretta, who had deserved to watch her son grow into something better than what he'd become. I cried for the boy Nathan had once been, the one who'd made me a birthday card out of paper bags and crayons one year, because we couldn't stretch to anything else, who had gone slack and heavy in my lap on long car trips. The boy who had said "Dad" like it was the only word that carried that particular meaning. I cried for that boy. The man he had turned into, I was still working out how to hold that. But the boy, the one who existed before Vivica, before ambition took over, before the long, gradual process of learning to treat his father as an asset rather than a person, I grieved that boy the way you grieve someone still living who has simply become impossible to reach. After a time, I stopped. I washed my face at the kitchen sink. I made a fresh pot of coffee and drank it, standing looking out the window at the streetlight on Hawthorne Ridge Road, throwing its yellow circle onto the November pavement. You always said the hard nights were just the nights before something, I told Loretta quietly to the kitchen. I'm choosing to believe you were right about that. The coffee was too strong the way I always make it. She used to say I made it too strong every time. I drank it anyway, because certain habits are the last map of a person you've loved, and you hold on to them even when there's no one left to give you grief about them. December arrived in Indianapolis the way it always does, not dramatically, but with a slow, gray persistence. The kind of cold that doesn't announce its arrival so much as accumulate. Until one morning you understand the world has shifted temperature, and you can't locate the exact moment it happened. The weeks after Thanksgiving moved the same way, not in any single collapse, but in gradual increments, each day adding something new to the pile of consequences. I watched it from a remove the way you watch a controlled demolition, knowing it's necessary, knowing you authorized it, and still flinching at each impact. The clip from the live stream reached 500,000 views by the Friday after Thanksgiving. By the following Monday, it had crossed 2 million. Vincent sent me the numbers not to feed any appetite for punishment, he said, but because he felt I should understand the scale of what had been captured. The comments, he told me, ran roughly 90% in my favor. Vivica's effort to shape the narrative lasted approximately 4 days. She released a statement through a PR firm. I heard about it from Philip, who forwarded it with a single line of his own. I've seen more convincing arguments written by first-year law students. The statement characterized the evening as a private family matter distorted by selectively edited footage. Within 6 hours, 3 separate guests who had been in that room uploaded their own unedited recordings in rebuttal. The second collapse was faster and louder than the first. Her social standing, which she had spent 15 years assembling with the patience and precision of someone building something meant to last, came apart in roughly 10 days. Invitations dried up. Her name was quietly removed from the planning committees of 2 charitable organizations she had co-chaired. The calls she placed to her closest friends, the women she'd hosted for dinner in that house, the ones who had laughed at her remarks and admired her table arrangements. Those calls went unreturned. I took no pleasure in this. I want to say that plainly. What befell Vivica was the direct outcome of what Vivica had done. And I have lived long enough to know that consequences of that magnitude carry their own weight without requiring anyone to add to them. Nathan called me twice in December. The first time I didn't answer, not from anger. I had moved well past anger into something quieter and more lasting, but because I wasn't ready. And I've learned at 68 that readiness matters more than most people allow. The second time I picked up. "Dad?" His voice bore no resemblance to the one I'd heard at the dinner table. The social veneer was completely gone. What was left was thinner and more honest. "I don't know what to say. I've spent 3 weeks trying to figure out what to say, and I've got nothing." "Then don't say anything," I told him. "Just listen for a minute." A pause. "Okay." "Satya, I found something," I said, "when I was going through the storage room last week. A box of your mother's belongings I hadn't opened since we moved them from her studio." I steadied myself. There was a journal in it. She kept it the year you started middle school. I hadn't known it was there. His breath caught audibly. "Dad." "I'm going to send it to you," I said. "I'm not going to read you passages from it, and I'm not going to tell you what's inside. You're going to read it for yourself, and when you're done—" My throat pulled tight. I pushed through it. "When you're done, you'll understand certain things I never managed to find the right words for myself." "What kind of things?" His voice had gone very small. "The kind a mother puts down on paper at 11 o'clock at night, when she believes no one will ever read it," I said. "The kind that's more honest than anything we manage to say out loud." He didn't answer straight away. I could hear him breathing, careful, deliberate, the breathing of a man working hard not to come apart on the phone. "Are you angry at me?" he asked finally. The question was so bare, so stripped of everything except its own honesty, that it caught me unprepared. "No," I said, and I meant it, which surprised me less than I expected. "I'm tired, Nathan, and I'm sad. But I'm not angry." "I don't understand how you're not." "Because anger burns through something," I said. "And I'd rather spend what I have on something that grows." I packaged the journal 3 days later. Loretta's neat handwriting, filling the pages, the entries from the winter of 2000 when Nathan was 12, and we were stretching every dollar we could find. I wrapped it in brown paper the way she used to wrap things, with proper corners and enough tape. I put no letter in with it. The journal said everything that needed saying. It reached Nathan's apartment. He had moved out of the Meridian Hills house, I'd been told, within 2 weeks of Thanksgiving, on a Wednesday morning in mid-December. He called that evening. He could barely form words. He tried twice to begin a sentence, and both times what he had was swallowed before it could arrive, taken down by something that wasn't quite crying, but occupied the same ground. "Mom," he finally got out. Just the one word, not a sentence, not an explanation, just her name passed to me across a phone line, like something he was returning. "I know," I said. And then, because some things are whole in themselves and don't need anything added, I said, "Get some sleep, son." I set down the phone. I sat in the kitchen on Hawthorne Ridge Road with the December dark against the windows and my coffee going cold beside me. And I thought about Loretta writing those pages while I slept, 20 feet away, putting into a journal the things she couldn't say at the dinner table because in those years we were both working to make everything seem manageable, to make everything seem fine. She had always been braver than me when she had a pen in her hand. A year is a long time. Long enough for a company to fail, and a marriage to come apart, and a man to discover slowly and at some cost what he is actually built from. Long enough for an old man to remember why he made his life the way he made it. Long enough, perhaps, for something broken to just begin finding its way into a different shape. The Thursday before the final week of November 2024, I arrived at the Prospect Street Community Center at 3 o'clock in the afternoon to help with setup. It was not a grand venue. Low ceilings, folding tables, the stackable plastic chairs that put you in mind of church basements and school gymnasiums. But the room carried the smell of roasted turkey and cornbread and cinnamon, and somebody had lined the windows with paper leaf cutouts, orange and red and yellow, the work of children from the after-school program that used the space during the week. I stood in the doorway for a moment and felt something release in my chest that I hadn't known was being held. Vincent and Cecile arrived at 4. Cecile had graduated from the wheelchair to a cane over the course of the year. Her hip replacement in February had gone well, and she moved with the careful, considered pace of someone who no longer takes mobility for granted. She came through the door, took in the room, the paper leaves, the folding tables, and said, "Now this is a party." I laughed. A real one, unguarded, and it caught me off guard with how good it felt. "Cecile," I said, "you look wonderful." "I feel wonderful." She pressed my arm with her free hand, her grip warm and sure. "How are you, Russell?" And I mean actually not the version you give people at church. "Better," I said. "Actually better." She studied my face for a moment, with the direct, undeceivable attention of a woman who has lived 8 decades and knows the gap between performed contentment and the genuine article. Then she gave one nod, satisfied. "Good," she said. "Loretta would be pleased." The words settled gently without the sharp sting they would have carried a year before. I had noticed that happening slowly across the preceding months. Her name landing in conversation, not as a wound, but as a warmth. The way winter sunlight through a window still carries heat. "She would have loved this room," I said. She always held that the best tables were the ones with mismatched chairs. Vincent appeared at my shoulder carrying 2 styrofoam cups of coffee from the urn in the corner. He offered me one without ceremony. I took it and drank it, and it was terrible. And it was exactly right. "How many tonight?" he asked. 63 confirmed, I said. "The coordinator thinks we could reach 70 with walk-ins." "Good." He looked around the room with an expression I recognized, the expression of a man who has built things and understands the difference between what impresses people and what actually functions. "This is good, Russell." By 5:30, the room was full and loud in the right way. The noise of people who are genuinely glad to be somewhere, not performing gladness for an audience. Volunteers moved between the tables with baskets of rolls and pitchers of apple cider. Near the window, a woman was teaching 3 children a clapping game. An elderly veteran in a Korean War veteran's cap held court at one end of a table, 2 young men leaning in to catch every word. I was at the serving station refilling a water pitcher when I heard the door. I turned. Nathan was standing at the entrance. Dark jeans, a plain gray Henley beneath an open jacket, his hair carrying the slight damp of the November air outside. He had lost weight over the past year, not drastically, but enough that his face had shed some of its practiced smoothness, that polished layer that money and ease lay down over time. What was left beneath it was sharper, more angular, more honest somehow. He was wearing an apron. He'd put it on before coming in, already tied, already prepared to work the way a person arrives when they want it understood from the outset that they are not there as a guest. He scanned the room and found me. For a moment he simply stood in the doorway, hands loose at his sides, his jaw working slightly the way it had when he was a boy, and had something he needed to tell me but hadn't found the opening yet. His eyes were bright, not with tears exactly, but with the particular brightness of someone carrying something heavy and doing their best to hold it level. "I wasn't sure I should come," he said. His voice stayed low beneath the room noise meant only to reach me. "But you did," I said. "Yeah." He swallowed. "I did." "Then go find Patrice at the serving table. She'll put you to work." Something moved across his face. Relief, I thought, and underneath it, something more complicated. The beginning of something that didn't yet have a name, but might given sufficient time. He nodded. He pulled himself up slightly, and he walked into the room and found his way to the serving table and took up a ladle and began filling bowls. I watched him for a moment before I turned back to my own work. Near the end of the evening, when the tables were winding down and the volunteers had moved into the easy rhythm of cleanup, I stepped outside for a few minutes. The air was cold and clear, the Prospect Street lights throwing their circles down onto the pavement. I reached into my jacket pocket and took out Loretta's scarf. I held it in both hands, dark green wool, the finished join between her work and mine invisible in the low light. "We had a good night, Retta," I said. 67 people. Good food, real food. Nathan came." I paused. "I don't know yet what he'll become, but he came. That's something. If you've stayed with me until the end of this one, I want to say thank you." This story asked a lot of both of us. I have thought about Russell a great deal since I first heard what happened to him. What it cost him to sit at that table and absorb everything that was done to him without breaking. What it cost him even more to walk away, not in anger, but in clarity. I believe God does not waste the hard years. The patience Russell carried, the love he kept giving, even when it was thrown back at him, the quiet way he let the truth do what he never allowed himself to do, none of that was lost. It all arrived exactly when it needed to. Here is what this story taught me, and what I hope it leaves with you. Protecting someone from every consequence is not love, it is delay. Real love sometimes means letting the ground give way. When someone shows you who they are over a long stretch of time, believe the pattern, not the apology. Family justice does not always come loud. Sometimes it comes through a single evening, a phone recording, and 47,000 witnesses who weren't even invited. And if you ever find yourself drawn to Dad's revenge stories, ask yourself what draws you, because most of the time, it is not the revenge at all. It is the dignity, the quiet refusal to be made small. That is the part worth carrying. If this story moved, you leave a comment and let me know what stayed with you. Share it with someone who might need to hear it today. And if you haven't already subscribed to Wise Revenge, there are more stories here, and every one of them matters. Thank you for listening. Take good care of yourself.